It was a bitterly cold spring morning. There was frost on the ground, animals tucked away in their dens, barely a bit of birdsong in the trees, and yet there was a woman running barefoot through the land, her long red dress staining darker as she moved. That icy breath that rolled out in front of her made her journey all the more urgent. She was making her way towards the home of Crunach. He had once been this wealthy farmer, but when his wife died, he took to the bed with depression. The farm was becoming barren and desolate. His home was falling to wrack and ruin. And as she got closer, she could see the land he was duty-bound to care for had not been maintained through the winter. And when she looked in the windows of his home, she could see that these malnourished beings in front of the fire were his children. The situation was far more dire than she realised. She needed to get inside. She pounded against the door. "Go away," said Crunach. He hadn't dealt with visitors since his wife had died, but she wasn't taking no for an answer. So she used her body and forced open the door. And all the heads in the household turned to her. She knew that her tall, strongly built form greatly contrasted to the hungry people inside, but that her hair, the colour of polished copper, and her glistening green eyes, they made her a sight to behold. She carefully came into the household, went to prepare a meal for Crunach and his family, but when she realised there was no food there, she took a bowl out to the barn and began to milk one of the cows, but she was aware of being followed. Crunach, he'd stepped out into the daylight for the first time in months. "Who are you?" he called to her. "You do not need to know who I am, but I have come to be your wife." And she knew that Crunach was in such a desperate need of care that he wouldn't turn her away. And so that day she prepared the most delicious meal the family had had for months. She tended to the farm, and she stayed the first night with him as his wife. The farm began to flourish under her care, for every waking moment was consumed by restoring the land to its health again, and she preferred to work alone, telling Crunach he would only just get in the way. And Crunach, well, his wealth and his status as a successful farmer, it came back to him. And he knew she was different, but he didn't want to jeopardise this situation. So he never questioned how or why his wife could plough a field as well as an ox, how she could lift on her back these enormous tubs of butter, or how she could run up the side of a mountain as fast as a stray heifer or horse. 9 months later, the smell of autumn was on the wind, and she was expecting her first child. And the harvest time, well, she wanted to preserve her body for giving birth, so she was withdrawing from her duties on the farm. But at this time of the year, many festivals were taking place around the countryside. And Crunach, he'd gotten an invitation to such a festival, the kind of invitation you didn't really want to turn down. You see, the King of Ulster, McKenna, was hosting this grand lunacy feast, and he had invited all of the wealthy lords in the land, and Crunach, he'd just gotten his reputation back. He didn't want to turn down this opportunity, so he approached her and asked would she like to come, but she was heavily pregnant, and the last thing she wanted to be was around a whole load of crowds. So she told him that he could go, and she said when he'd return, their child would most likely be born. But as he turned on his heels to leave, she reached out to him, warning, "Do not tell anyone about me. I don't want you to tell anyone about anything you have seen me do." And off he went. Now, the days in which she expected to go into labour went by, and no pains of childbirth ever came. But also, those days in which Crunach said he also would have returned by had also long since passed, and there was no sign of him. Until one dark morning, she wasn't expecting upon her door this fierce banging. She opened it and found soldiers were there, asking her was she Crunach's wife, and when she said yes, they produced a scroll to her. "The wife of Crunach is to be summoned in the court of Armagh. She is to present herself before King Conor McNessa, and until she arrives, her husband Crunach will remain under our imprisonment." She was terrified for her husband's safety. She didn't dare question this. She left immediately. She was paraded across the land of Ulster. She was brought into the court of Armagh, where she walked by the famous Ulster warriors, men that were famous for protecting the province against invasion, but they were laughing at her. So she kept her gaze low to the ground, and she continued walking forward until she looked up to see King Conor McNessa upon his throne, and beside him her husband in chains. And she bowed to the king, and she asked why had she been brought here. But the King of Ulster was not known for being a kind or compassionate man. "So you are the wife of Crunach," he said. "Well, I want you to know your husband is after making a mockery of me. You see, I bought 2 white stallions, and I was racing them against all of the other lords' horses, and they won every race. And then your husband in front of everyone said that you can run faster than my white stallions. Well, I want to see if that's true. So we've set up a wee tournament on the field out there and we're going to watch you run. And then we'll see who's really the fastest one in all of Ulster. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Please don't make me run. You can see I'm very close to giving birth. Wait till after I've had my child, then I will run for you. But the king, he didn't want to hear this. So she turned to her husband, won't you stand up for me? But Cruannach was so afraid of what might happen to him. He couldn't even look her in the eye. And so she turned to the court of warriors. All of you here, won't you think your mother, think of the mercy you'd once shown to her. But these Ulster warriors were also gambling men. And there was money on the line. And she couldn't believe it. And she found herself at the start of the race next to the king's white stallions. A cloud passed over the sun, plunging the place into shadow. A crowd gathered along the edge of the field. The horns that normally signalled the start of war were blown, and then the race began. The horses took off, galloping away at full speed. There was no way she could keep up. They kicked the grass up into her face. Every bit of her body was aching in pain. She looked to the crowd. She could see they were laughing at her, that the King of Ulster was drinking deeply from his goblet, that her husband Cruannach was still unable to look her in the eye, when an unholy rage took over her body. And she began to possess these otherworldly powers as she took off running faster and faster, faster and faster. She was overtaking the king's horses. Faster and faster, faster and faster, faster and faster. She crossed the finish line in first place. But running that fast was very traumatic to her pregnancy. And she collapsed to the ground, giving birth to not just a child, but a set of twins. And something had gone very wrong. The sky blackened, a wind picked up, tents began to lift, horses began to run, and the men of Ulster started to feel this pain going through their bodies as they realised she was no ordinary woman, that she had in fact been a goddess. And she took the bodies of her children up in her arms and spoke to them with a voice that came from the centre of the earth itself. I am Macha, a goddess of sovereignty, here to protect the land you failed to care for, and for the cruelty that you've shown me here today. I am to put a curse on all of you, that in your greatest hour of need you will all fall on your backs with the pains of childbirth for 5 nights and 4 days and 9 generations, and so you never forget what you did to me or to my children. This place will forever bear their name. This place will be called the Twins of Macha, Awin Vaca. And with that she disappeared, and the men were left screaming and howling in this pain that was tearing them apart. And so it was, in their greatest hour of need, when the northern army of Ulster under Conor MacNessa faced off the western army of Connacht under Queen Maeve in the most epic story that exists in Irish mythology, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, that the Ulster army was struck down by that curse of Macha. And the only person left to defend them against the entire army of Connacht was someone who was just a boy at the time. But that's a story for another day.